I see a thumbs up. And we'll call this meeting to order. So this is a regular additional meeting on September 21, 2020 for the school board. Roll call, we are missing one board member at this time. I'm expecting him to show up shortly, and that's Mike Brink. Otherwise, we're all present. Public comments, we have one person here in person to make a comment. So, Ron. Welcome.
Hello.
If you just state your name, address, and relationship to the school district.
My name is Matthew Savola. I live at 6521 Hickory Lane, town of Vienna. I have two kids in the high school, one junior and one freshman. And I'm here just to try to speak on behalf of them. I've watched all the school board meetings, and I've heard a lot of the comments in even the media, and a lot of it kind of skews towards the opening of the K through 4. And it almost seems like that high school grade levels are kind of put on the back burner. And I'm hoping, I'm assuming that's not the case, but I'm just here just to state opinion that kind of seems what it might be. I just, that the grades, any grades in third grade really don't affect what colleges you get into, or if you do get into a college, but they do as a freshman and through high school. That's something that is important, and I just think that if we move forward to put kids into school, that I don't want that to be, well, we'll just get to those kids whenever we get to them. I'd like that to have some sort of, I guess, idea where we're going to be going with that, so that those kids don't get left behind, and just we'll fix it when we get to you. So that is all I have for you guys, and I appreciate everything you guys do.
Well, I would suggest, if you can, get home and watch tonight's meeting, because we will be talking about the high school.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, sir.
Thanks. Okay.
At your seat, I did hand out another public comment that I received that wasn't sent out to the board. I had shared with the individual that I would provide it to you in writing with regarding school reopening task force conversation. So, provided that to you. They said they did not need it read as long as everybody received it, and everybody received it in paper copy tonight.
And with that, I'd like to have a motion to approve the agenda. And second by Jack. Any questions? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? And we have approved the agenda. And with that said, Randy has asked if we could hold our questions for a bit, because all three of these are so interrelated. So he's going to do the presentation of each of them so that you'll understand all the parts. And then we'll go back, obviously, and take care of our part of the business, which is approving some version of something.
Right. Awesome. Thank you, Dave. And I appreciate that latitude. As I looked at all the information that we've put into this packet for tonight and trying to really summarize it in parts, I think it's best to see the whole picture and then being able to kind of come back around to it on a per piece basis. So what I'm going to try to do, and some of this I realize is in board book and you've read it, but I also know that there's folks watching, so I want to try to do a bit of a summary of where we've been and really what the documents that we're going to show you. And we'll pull them up to the degree that they're applicable and will be helpful to you. And basically, I will try to hit the high pieces. I mean, Brian and Kurt will also jump in here at a point to help us understand some of the impacts with regards to contact tracing and some of the things we've learned. And then Brian will also talk about some things with staff. And then I think that'll give you kind of a broad picture. I know Mike and Mark, you both provided me a few questions beforehand, and we'll try to address some of those as we walk through here tonight. And then others, obviously, we'll try to address as they come up here tonight. Does that seem fair for everybody? All right, the first thing is when we go back to our board meeting on September 14th, what we had decided at that point was we were reviewing kind of where we were with the Supreme Court ruling a few weeks ago, which left on the table the motion of the board to bring back K through 4, and then our enhanced remote options for kids. Enhanced remote was really those students in special ed, ELL, children with some of the social emotional needs that we need to address, and then also some of our lab classes, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. We had stated at the meeting on the 14th that before we made any further decisions to bring back additional groups, that we had a medical ad hoc committee meeting on the 16th. So that meeting took place. So generally what you are seeing in front of you in the memo is a summary of that meeting. And I've provided that in writing to you in paper form so that you can utilize that as we go along. Some of the pieces that we were trying to accomplish at that meeting was certainly a question about, I think the question that came from the board, and it was certainly there from administration, was in the absence of now a metric that was as part of an order with public health, what should we be looking at with regards to reopening school? And through that discussion came really a three-prong approach to wanting to, of things that we should be looking at, and this came from our medical professionals in that committee. The first thing they asked us is they said the overarching guiding principle should be, does opening school and bringing more children together and congregating them in our schools and educating them in person, how does that impact the disease burden in our community? So that's really was kind of an overarching theme of part of our conversation. They felt in order to mitigate that, there were three things that we needed to have in place. And this is what we'll be talking about this evening, and what's part of a framework that we have worked on to present to you this evening as well. The three-pronged piece was make sure that your nursing and contact tracing processes are solid and in place. So making sure that we had a way to follow our contact tracing, know what we were doing, and we felt comfortable with that. The challenge that we had, and I know, Mike, this gets to part of the question that you had, is this is kind of a new topic for us in front of the board. We haven't talked about contact tracing in a lot of depth up until we really had the conversation with the ad hoc committee last week. Part of the reason for that is we truly didn't know what the impact of having students in our schools looked like, what that was going to do with our staff, or what process we had to follow. And our contact tracing training from the county, as far as how best to do that from public health, occurred on September 10th. So that's 2 days after we started school. From there, trying to then apply those processes, make sure that we're doing it properly, allowed us then, we shared that information at the ad hoc committee on the 16th. And I think that there was just generally a learning curve to see what does that process look like, and what do we need in order to do it well, and to make sure that we can continue to do it well as we bring back more students. So that's where that came from. And I realize that it sounds like, well, you have something we never have talked about, but part of it was we didn't know what degree of a need we were going to have until we had some experience in it, and also had some feedback of ways that we should be doing it. The other piece is I believe we had a process built off of an anticipation public health would do a lot of the contact tracing for us. We have found that with the things that are happening with public health, they're not really weighing in on a local level for that. So that aspect is falling on our staff to be able to do it with our students and our staff in our community. So that was one of the processes for nursing and contact tracing. The second was tracking your data, and that's part of what we'll talk about in a little bit. Kurt will share with you kind of what data we're collecting, what are we tracking, when we're talking about contact tracing and our disease measures, what are we actually discussing? We threw out a number at the last ad hoc committee, about 19 on a list. we want to talk about what that actually means, give you an example of kind of how that looks, so that you have an understanding of what our process looks like. We're also looking and tracking kids that that have symptoms. Come to school and now you have a headache, nausea, a fever. How are we tracking that? And then also from the HR perspective, I believe like this morning we had 7 staff who were not coming into our building based off of how they answered their symptom checker this morning. They were able to continue teaching through our process we described at our last board meeting and able to teach from home in order to accomplish their instruction. So that's a piece that we're looking to be tracking. And then the third piece is looking at our community data. Up until recently, we haven't been able to get a handle on what does Waunakee data actually mean. And to be honest, the pieces that we've also prior to this we're having to rely on were specifically data coming out of the Public Health Madison-Dane County, because those were part of an order of which we needed to follow. When that order and that part of the order no longer became enforceable, that was the question the board, very rightfully so, says, well, what metric are we going to be following? And what the ad hoc committee came out with is you still need to follow the Dane County metrics, but to the degree that we're able to aggregate it down, or disaggregate it down, to our Waunakee trends to see how that's trending either parallel or different than the county, that's important information. That's one of the pieces that we're going to share with you in just a minute is kind of some of the data with regards to how we've been able to do that from a census tract data piece through Wisconsin DHS that generally gets us very close to the perimeters of our school district. They also asked us to start looking at hospitalization rates and then testing capacity. From that point, the question then was, well, where are we sitting with bringing more students back? And their recommendation at that point was for us to take a period of time, and they put out there 3 to 4 weeks, for us to see where is our data trending to now that we had a snapshot and a baseline of where Waunakee data is, take some time to really build that forward and see what that looks like moving forward. They also said make sure that we have our processes in place for our nursing and contact tracing, including looking at what happens if our rate of contact tracing increases and where our staffing needs are. The ad hoc committee was then going to come back together on October 7th, and at the October 7th meeting would then review our data, and that would be in a period after 2.5 to 3 weeks to see where our data is trending, give us additional feedback on what that means for reopening, help us interpret the data, and then put us in a place where we could make a recommendation at the following week's board meeting. Some things that administratively that we are moving forward with is one, accessing the data that we have for our district. And I think that's just a piece I'd like to just take a minute and Kurt, if we can pull that up, if you can kind of share with the group. So I'm looking at the chart, Rebecca, that looks like this. No, the one revised, it's the census one. Yep, that one's fine, perfect. This is what you have in your document, and what Kurt has done is he's gone through and found the census data for the different tracts that generally correlate very closely with our district. They're not a complete perfect corollary, but they're extremely close. And then starting to track, they just have an aggregate number at the DHS site. So what we're starting to do is now break it into what's happening. So on the 15th, that's our baseline data, and then we're moving it forward to see kind of how does that trend over time. And at the very bottom, Rebecca, if you can scroll down, because that's probably the most important part, right there, where it has totals for Waunakee area. If there's a way you can just increase the magnification, that would be helpful. up on the top. There you go. There you go, and go down to the Waunakee data. There you go, thank you. I mean, that gives you then an idea of some of the things that we're looking at tracking. Some of these we do not have populated yet because we have 6 days of data. Tomorrow we'll be able to populate the 7 days. And then in a week we'll be able to do the 14 days. And the burden rate was a number you got off of, Kurt, off the DHS site. That's on a 14-day basis. So I know that I kind of covered a lot of the things you were going to talk about there, Kurt, but as you're looking at the data, that's a piece that, if you can talk about kind of how you were looking to kind of populate that, and then figuring out some of these, extrapolating these forward for us as a district.
Yeah, so again, coming out of the medical advisory committee, they gave us some ideas of information that we should look at a local level. So the categories that I have are the data that they suggested. Some of the information I just need to do some of the calculations later in the chart, but those are the pieces of information that we're tracking and monitoring every day. It's the number of positives, the number of total tests, negatives, and then we're looking at percent positives on a daily basis. As you can see, that fluctuates a lot. One thing that we have learned and is true on this chart, Mondays you tend to get smaller numbers because fewer people are tested over the weekends. So the larger numbers are during the week that you see. As Randy said, we will be, as of tomorrow, we will have a 7th day where we can then do a 7-day average. And then 7 more days we'll be able to do a 14-day average. Again, the Medical Advisory Committee suggested looking at the averaging as a true sign of how things are trending. The last item, the burden rate, again was something that one of the doctors on the Medical Advisory Committee talked about, and that's in regards to the level of burden that is on the system. And it's not just us as a school, but it is truly on the entire system. So healthcare, in addition to us as a school, and monitoring that as well. So every day I go out to the map on the Department of Health Services site, and I get this number. They post it daily. So I go out and I get the information daily. I put it on the chart, and then I built formulas in there that do the calculations, and that we're going to continue to do that as long as we have to, I guess. We'll continue to gather that information.
Kurt, can I have you talk about the FAQ attached to your
yes.
document? There's also an FAQ
Yes,
that Kurt put together, just to help explain some of the nuances with the data.
Yeah. So the last item on the FAQ is it talks about the burden rate and how it's calculated, and then they have a chart that talks about where do you fall with your burden rate. Are you low, moderately high, or high? Again, we don't have a number yet to compare to the chart, and that'll be a while because that's a 14-day number, and we're a ways away before we can collect that burden rate for us locally. There are burden rates out there county-wise and state-wise, and Dane County is a high burden rate, as are most counties in the state of Wisconsin. I think there's only one county that isn't a high right now. I think that's Price County, which is up north. The second question on there, I put it on there very specifically because our data showed on the 17th of September that one of our census tracts actually had a negative case count. It went down. If you do the positive change per day, on the 17th we show a negative. So I saw that and I asked myself, well, that kind of looks funny. That shouldn't happen, should it? So I went out and I found an FAQ that the state has put together. And as you can see, there are reasons why you can have a case count that would go down or would change from one day to the next. My guess is, as they did an initial reporting, a case got put into that particular track, but then upon further investigation or contact tracing at their level, they determined that the person didn't actually live in that census tract, but lived in a different census tract. So then they removed it from this one and put it into the correct one. So you will see fluctuations that are basically corrections to the data. So I thought it was particularly important to put that on this FAQ and to talk about that as well, that there are fluctuations just because of things like that happening.
Number one.
I gotta get my glasses for this because I don't remember what number one was. What's number one? I gotta find my sheet because I can't read that up there on the screen. What happens when you get old? There it is. Oh, and the other point I thought was very important is that once a person tests positive, if they test positive 5 times over the course of an experience for them, only 1 time are they reported as positive on the charts. So there isn't an inflation because a person who's positive would get tested multiple times. So I thought that was important to note as well. As I continue to experience this more, I'm sure I will add more FAQs to this document. But I thought those 3 were pretty important to begin with, at least.
So what we provided you tonight is 6 days of data, just to give you an idea of what that looks like. And this will be a piece that, from Kurt's perspective, and working with kind of a team of our staff, to continue to keep this updated. And then the objective is then to create a dashboard for our district for data that we can then report on a periodic basis. Right now we are talking on like a weekly basis to be able to at least show some of the snapshots of what's occurring. Feel that tracks similarly to how other data is reported, and to at least show where we're trending and be able to show that from a county and also from a Waunakee district boundaries perspective. So we'll talk a little bit more about some of how those dashboards may look. But this is the data pieces that we're looking at as far as really incidents and cases across our area to see what the disease burden and what the disease activity is that's occurring. Internally, we're also collecting data as well. And that's when I talked about earlier, contact tracing. So what Kurt's going to show here today is, this is the one Rebecca to pull up, is from a training that they went through on the 10th of September from DHS or from Public Health with regards to training for how we should be following contact tracing and what some of the things that we need to be aware of are. And then the second part that he'll share with you, we just created one line, kind of a mock from a spreadsheet that we're using to track individuals on, and just walk you through what that process looks like so that you're familiar with it. So I'll turn it back over to you, Kurt, to really talk about the form in front of you that's in your packet with the dots on it.
So what this chart really does is it kind of shows you the timeline of exposure to the end of close contact determination and what happens within that process. So if you look at the dashed line that goes right through the number 2, and then to the right of that you see 2 dots. just so you know, I'm not saying colors because I'm colorblind, and what I would say as a color probably wouldn't match your opinion of a color. So that's why I'm describing this the way I'm describing it. So those two dots show, the two that are on top of each other, show that a symptom has started to show in an individual. Well, we don't start contact tracing at the moment that a symptom shows in an individual. There needs to be a length of time that happens for the individual to actually be identified as being positive for COVID, which kind of suggests those dots that are further to the right. But then we have to go backwards in time. So an infection can happen, you go all the way to the left, anywhere from 14 days to the onset of symptoms. We don't have to contact trace 14 days backward, but we do have to trace 2 days backward, which again is that dashed line that goes through the number 2. So we have to have the individual recall individuals they were in contact with 2 days prior to that onset of symptoms, which is generally what drives them to be tested. So once we know that point, then we begin to work forward and backwards, really. And then follow up with all of the individuals that individual shares with us as being a person that they've been in contact with. Now, our focus is only in the school setting, so we only worry about contacts that are related to school. So if this is a student, we want to know what other students they may have been in contact with and staff that they may have been in contact with. Similarly, for a staff member, we also want to know students they've been in contact with and other staff that they've been in contact with. So that's kind of the process that we follow, going back to go forward.
Why don't you go to the next sheet, Rebecca, the one that actually got that one right there. So when we talk about somebody who now shows up on that sheet with the dots, what's actually happening and what are we recording? So last week at the committee we talked about 19 people are being identified on a sheet. This is the sheet this is a mock-up. This is a fictionary example. But there were 19 of them, and today we've added people.
We are up to
that.
23 right now.
Yeah, so but I thought it would be helpful to at least walk through, once somebody hits that contact tracer's kind of radar, and we add them to the sheet, what happens. So this is a pretty realistic example of things that are occurring. So I'll let you walk through it, Kurt, because I know you and the nurses are very familiar with it because you're doing it every day.
So the fourth column is where we start to enter the information about what happened for the particular student that we have. We find out from multiple sources individuals who have either tested positive or who have been a close contact. And that's what that number 23 represents, what the number 19 represented last week. It is a person who has either tested positive or has been in close contact with a person who has tested positive. Because those two groups of individuals need to not come to school for a period of time. Or, as we're also finding out, our middle school and high school students who are involved in cross-country, golf, football, if they're a middle school or high school student, they cannot come to those activities as well. So we need to track those individual students as well. So in this particular case, and this is how it can play itself out, this individual was a close contact with somebody. So we determined that the last contact for that person was on the 19th of September So we did the calculation from the beginning and said that the person was would be able to come back on the 21st. Well, during that time frame, and as we quickly learned, contact tracing is not a one and done event. It's an ongoing event until you clear a case, which is on the far right-hand side of this chart. So what happened was, and what has happened a few times, is a family member is the close contact. Well, what happens then is potentially another family member then becomes a positive case. And if Dustin, I believe is what I call this person, Dustin now is in contact with that second positive, now the clock starts all over again. So the clock started all over again. And then Dustin started to show some signs or symptoms, went and got tested, and turned out to be a positive for COVID. So then the clock starts again, a different clock starts again. Now, once Dustin has gone the 10 days because of the positive test, and if Dustin has no fever that is being controlled by fever-reducing medication, and symptoms have improved, not subsided, but symptoms have improved, is then able to come back to school. If the symptoms are still significant, he would not be allowed to come back until the symptoms improve. They don't have to completely go away, but they have to improve. So it's still staying in contact to help judge when indeed the student is able to come back to school. Again, I want to make sure that everybody understands the 23 cases that we currently have of staff and students are either a positive or a close contact. Okay, it's not one or the other, it's a combination of both. So some are positives, some are close contacts. And that's why they're not attending school right now.
Can you share with us how many positive cases there are for the test positive?
I don't believe I can do that because of the number, because that could reveal information that is.
So one person could be positive, and that could affect 10 or 3 or 4 of those other
That is
students.
true.
Or, so just because we've got 19 or 23 positive and close contact doesn't mean that we've got a lot of positive cases.
Correct. That is correct.
I think we can say we don't have anything right now where we've had one positive that's impacted like 15 people.
No.
Most of our contacts have been relatively
Correct.
small, contained within families, and then we have to track to make sure to see kind of where's the intersection of those family members with other activities that we have at school.
Yeah. It is important to note that we have had students who have been in-person learning who have had to transition to virtual learning during this time frame. We have had that.
The piece that Kurt just shared was, I mean, it goes back to your questions, Mike. I mean, I don't know if we really had a good sense of what our level of activity was going to be or the burden that was going to be on staff and required time when we started school on the 8th. And also looking at just the impacts, even for kids not necessarily all just in person, but also some of our virtual kids who have family members who may have younger siblings or who are involved in some of our other activities. That's kind of what's taking place. And then parallel that with folks on the list that fall within our staffing ranks as well. Same type of story and scenario. Kurt gave an example of a student, but you can very easily have a very similar type of thing with a staff member.
One other thing.
Oh, go ahead.
One other thing Randy had mentioned about, we're kind of keeping two sets of student staff information. So there's this, which are the positive tests and the close contact. What we're also doing is we're keeping another spreadsheet separate from this in regards to individual students, this is all students, who are not attending school because we have either sent them home with COVID-like symptoms, they have not been tested, but again, following the public health guidance of when we should be sending individuals home if they have symptoms. We are tracking 28 students between our 3 elementary schools who are all in-person students who have either been sent home by us or whose parents have said, I'm not sending my child to school because of the symptoms that they have. And then, of course, the health staff are following up with the parents to find out what the symptoms are, how long they've had them, etc. So we are monitoring 28 students at the 3 elementary schools who are in that situation with symptoms, COVID-type symptoms, who are not currently coming to school. Again, they are not a close contact. They do not have a positive test. But they are students who are currently not coming to school because of symptoms.
So part of what Kurt's sharing is this is the information that the ad hoc committee had asked us to continue to track, and that being kind of our internal school district data, to then be able to lay that against our then ability to make sure that we are properly staffed to be able to address some of the contact tracing pieces. So the other piece you have in your packet is then an assessment of kind of what are some of our needs as we start to move forward with desires to move forward with more grade levels. And making sure that we don't find ourselves in a position where we put ourselves in jeopardy of not being able to keep up with that important work that's present. So you see a memo in your packet from Brian Grabarski, our Human Resources Director. Just as a point of review, we have 1.5 nurse FTEs in our district, and we have 6 FTE health assistants. We have a health assistant in every building, plus we have 1.5 nurses. As we took a look at kind of our growing needs here and wanting to really stay on top of to do the best we can with the contact tracing, the committee talked about really a COVID command center. And I would say we kind of loosely have that. That's kind of Kurt, the nurses, the health assistants. Brian is involved with that. I'm involved with that. Annie's involved from a communication perspective. But I think that what we are seeing is we are wanting to solidify that around this data, and then also add to our staff in order to make sure that we are robustly staffed to be able to adjust as these numbers shift and as we consider ways to bring in more students. So the recommendation in front of you, and then I'll let Brian talk about kind of just how those are structured, is adding a half-time to go from 1.5 nurses to 2, and then to add a contact tracing position. And when it says LTE health assistant, that's just a designator within our system, kind of how it falls classification-wise. Brian, can I just have you talk a little bit about kind of where those numbers came from and kind of what LTE means for you from an HR perspective?
Sure. So the FTE of the nurse, that is an extension of the current staff that we have. And as I mentioned before, that individual and the one that she replaced, both over the last handful of years have certainly been above the 100-day contracts that they are fulfilling. We had been satisfying that, having them time card extra days. Based on the discussion at the medical ad hoc committee, the idea arose to extend that to 2 full-time nurses. That would permit, obviously, each nurse to support, 3 buildings or double up if need be. The second position also came out of that discussion. LTE means limited term employee. So this is not a recurring position. And it is again, as it was identified, 1,000 hours. It is the remainder of the school year, averaging 30 or less hours per week. And so this would be and as by the way it would be posted and defined, this would be a position that would vary based on need in terms of how many hours it would work, but in terms of total number of hours, it would be 1,000 or less. The cost then associated with that, to extrapolate out, is it's a straight hourly wage. It's $15.75 per hour. That would put it into the general category of our health assistance, with the significant difference of it not having any benefits associated with it due to its term and variability.
So far what we've walked through is kind of the categories that came out of the committee. We talked about some of the data we're trying to track, the process for contact tracing that we're learning more about every day, what we think would be help move us forward with making sure that we do that at a high level. What I've also added to your memo is just kind of a breakdown of grade levels. And this isn't really tied to a timeline specifically, but at the point in time where we get to a decision of bringing back our 3rd and 4th grade students, just a reminder, we're asking for 2 weeks lead time for us to be able to get the logistics of any transfers between the models from parents and also the transportation pieces. Moving down to 5th and 6th grade, I think it's very similar. Now, after we have our 3rd and 4th grade students in, and then there's an assessment of data, which would be kind of a perspective of where the committee is coming from to have a gradual staged approach to reentry. Then again, there needing to be 2 weeks lead time to bring our 5th and 6th graders back once a decision point is made. I grouped 7-12 here together. We've had some conversations since I've sent this forward that's a lot of kids all at one time. So that could potentially be broken up to like 7-8 coming first and then 9-12 at another point. But I also wanted to remind the board that we have already approved, and it's a piece that we're in the process of planning around, of what we call enhanced remote. Enhanced remote was bringing in our high needs, special needs students. We have approximately 80 kids who started last week, 3 through grades 12. We also, with our English language learners, and also some of our students who may need additional services from our student services staff. And the secondary level right now is assessing on a program by program basis, what are some of the needs of how we could bring in tech ed, ag, some of those hands-on type classes, some of our lab classes, wanting to do that again in a measured approach, but wanting to see how we can bring some of those students in to further enhance their instruction, because some of those are very difficult to deliver in a virtual environment because they have such a hands-on piece. So I know Tim Schell shared with me today that there's a form they've put together to work with the teachers on to try to identify and prioritize some of those things. So the gentleman who spoke during public comments about some of the things we're talking about with our secondary level, I mean, he's right. A lot of our direction in our conversation has been focused on our lower level, because our metrics we were looking at initially were truly driven by public health and there were multiple steps before we would ever get to 7-12. So we were really putting our efforts to making sure we were delivering the virtual program as robustly as we could. And then also, at that point, the enhanced remote wasn't an option for us. It was a piece. So we're reinvigorating that conversation per our discussion with the board last week and putting some prioritization to it. That will lay in then also with the conversations that we just had about kind of the capacity of us bringing in students. So that piece is absolutely a piece that we have interest in forwarding. And that really leads to then kind of a decision-making framework. So if I can have you bring up the colored one. This is a piece that as we left the ad hoc committee and started to look at kind of different models of bringing things forward, we have two pieces to this. First of all, the decision-making approach at the top. And this is a piece that I think administratively we are looking for your feedback on, and if this is the direction that the board is looking to go. But as we kind of looked at the recommendations that came out of the discussions at our ad hoc committee, it seemed to really build off of a process of the medical ad hoc committee and the administrative team working together on collecting data, interpreting data, coming back together as an ad hoc to then give some recommendations or some thought process to the full board prior to decisions being made. The decision-making approach would leave the decision-making powers of bringing back grade level spans or any grade levels, or to have to pull back from grade levels if that ever needed to occur within the powers of the board. But there would also be a decision-making piece that if there was something that occurred, let's just say an outbreak in a school, or if there was an issue with the ability to secure staffing for a building or some other issue that would be much more short-term and immediate, that the administration would have the ability to then temporarily make a decision either on a few days basis or until we can get a board meeting together to then reevaluate. But that's kind of the approach that we at least extrapolated out of the ad hoc committee. On the back of this sheet shows what we are looking at as some of our data pieces. This is still, I would say, a work in progress. The piece that Kurt just got finished talking about with regards to contact tracing, putting together really a metric at the top of the sheet just to give you an idea of what's occurring in which buildings. I think right now we have individuals on our sheet from every building. The end number is just not high enough to reflect a number on each box of the chart. So that's where you see the aggregate numbers at the bottom. But you can see the positive cases, you can see the close contact numbers, positive students, and then the case close contacts. So I think that gets a little bit to what you were asking, Jack, but we aren't able to granulate it down any further per school unless the numbers are a little bit larger. Then you can see the community, the Waunakee area data, and the Dane County data. And then this, along with any other specific items and the cases per 100,000 and some of the other burden rates, would be pieces that we would continue to track. And this would be a basis then for working with our ad hoc medical community to help interpret that data and help advise us as far as how we are sitting as a community to be able to manage disease burden with any additional students and the impact on the community. So I realize that's a great deal of information, but I think just to break it down, it really goes back to the memo that I started off by summarizing on the front page, and it's kind of those A, B, and C are the three different components or principles to drive some of the decision making. Second of all is kind of the time frame between bringing back a group of students and how long do you need to track data before you make the next decision for another grade span coming in. Looking at some of the data that we are pulling in our internal pieces and the contact tracing needs and the HR request that's coming out of there. And then I think finally is taking a look at the decision-making approach or decision-making framework and asking the board to consider that or to make modifications to that so that we have a framework and a decision-making model that we can utilize moving forward. With that, Dave, I will open it up for any questions that you have, comments, and between Brian, Kurt, and I will do our best to answer them.
Jeff?
I think one of the things that we talked about, because right now we're new at this contact tracing, and it takes probably about a half hour, 40 minutes a day or per individual. You know, so when you look at it, you don't have the time. And you know, right now it seems to be that our nursing staff is kind of primary on collecting this and disseminating data. So one of the things we talked about was getting that point person, which is you know, the contact tracer, to make those calls, gather that information, disseminating it to the people that have to make the decisions, so that we can take the burden off the system. Then instead of taking a half hour, as you get better with it, you know, it may take 10 minutes or 20 minutes, but there's calls and follow-up calls and so forth. And having this in a kind of centralized area so that, you know, the information can be gathered and pulled together as opposed to individual points, it seemed to make sense because everything is coordinated and you know, you can make decisions quicker. So, and the other thing we talked about was, you know, we'd probably bring the Health Advisory Committee together maybe a week before the board meeting, you know, so that all of this stuff could be reviewed through that committee, and then it becomes, you know, information to the board, you know, the upcoming board meeting, so that, you know, you're making decisions, you know, on information that has been kind of reviewed or at least synthesized to the advisory committee.
The next question for Kurt. Are we receiving any data from families that are in remote learning?
Yes, we are. We are receiving some data for families that are in remote learning. We're not receiving from everybody who has something going on in their household, though. So there are some unknowns that we kind of know about, but we can't follow up on them because we don't necessarily have names. And the other challenge to this is there's a domino effect. So if you have a family who has 3 children and one of them is a close contact or a positive, then that whole family has to be followed up on whether they're virtual or not. Because again, we've learned through some of our younger kids about some older kids who may or may not be involved in some of those other activities that we have going on, which then we have to follow up to see if they are, so that we make sure that they're not coming to those events as well. And we also find the reverse. We'll find out from an older about a younger, and then we have to make sure that they're not involved in something as well. As you can see on that one chart that Randy just shared on that last document, you know, we're also tracking our 4K environment as well, to make sure that that is also not feeding into, while our 4Ks are in our community sites, we have to make sure that siblings who may be with us, we're also monitoring and tracking those as well. So we're tracking virtual as well as in person.
I would add to that too, Brian, that we've also had conversations with, we really need to encourage folks who, even though you're virtual, if there's something going on with your kids, your family, or contact, we want to know about that, because there are incidents also where kids are playing with other kids in the neighborhood, and the impacts of that with regards to needing to know that some of those close contacts may have occurred.
Right.
And those are some pieces that are evolving as we learn a little bit more about that, but we do need to or have an interest in hearing if there's even some of our virtual kids or families, because of some of the related activities that could also then of a piece that we should at least be aware of as we're tracking students and activities at school.
And that part's particularly important as we get closer to bringing in another grade. We wouldn't want an individual who's within that window. If we're going to bring in third and fourth, our next grade, we don't want a third or fourth grader coming in who really should be on quarantine or isolation. So we want to know that so that we make sure we prevent that from happening as well.
Okay, first of all, Brian Jack, I viewed the ad hoc committee meeting, and one thing I don't want to let slip by is the significant endorsement that the medical group gave to the leadership, Randy, Kurt, Brian, Steve, John, in implementing a sound, safe package. And I know we're not moving as fast as a lot of people want us to move, but there was a strong endorsement for the work we have done, the sense of it, safety, and reasonableness with it. And I want to thank all of you for that work. And then what you've done from that meeting to today, it's just simply amazing. I mean, this is a real blueprint to move forward, and so I can't thank you guys enough for everything you've done. The question I have, just in terms of, I have a lot of questions, but in terms of the actual positioning, do those positions allow us to function now, or will they also allow us to function when we bring the next group back in, or would we be pressed for services should that next group come in and then we'd have to hire at that point? Or so is this a now thing, or is this something that should work from your looking at the big picture? How does that fit in?
That's a great question, Mark. I would say there's two parts to that answer. I believe that the additional FTE that the nurse would add would provide us support and flexibility through the district. The contact tracing, at this point, it's not a 30-hour per week position. So it has built-in opportunities to absorb more hours and more growth. I've got it for full transparency. The best answer I can give you is it has room for growth. I cannot forecast how much room it has for growth because I don't know. I can't forecast what will happen as the fall progresses in terms of what will happen with COVID, what will happen in our county, our community, and certainly, what will additional kids interacting in our building need. So there is room. I believe it will take us into the future. I don't know how far into the future. I would say that we will continue to monitor that and bring forward additional proposals as they would become necessary. At this point, I believe it will take care of us into the future for a period of time.
I think to also answer that, it all depends on the number of cases that we have, right? So if the number of cases grow, we're going to need more. But I think where the growth is going to be is in the LTE position. So you may need maybe another or a second or third LTE to do the contact tracing. But given the workload, once you make the decision, you get the information in front of you, you should be able to work within these means from what my understanding was.
Yeah, I agree with Brian and Jack on that I go back to something that I think both Dr. Random and Dr. Anderson said at our medical advisory committee, and something that I know in talking to people at public health, and Brian knows in talking to people at the UW in regards to contact training and processes and procedures is, one, processes and procedures are constantly changing. You have to adapt to what's happening. In regards to contact tracing position, public health continues to add those positions, as does UW Health, based on the need that they have to do the work. So as we continue to bring in more students, yes, we will need more time to do those things. How much is anybody's guess, because it does depend on what happens to the pattern, the trend that we see. If it maintains or goes down, less of a need. If it continues to go up, as we've seen recently, greater demand. So,
But to that point, if you look at your contact trace or your census tract data, that's been relatively consistent in 1 or 2 cases per area.
in the 6 days that I've really been tracking this, we've gone up 40 positives, 40 positives in those 6 days.
So Randy, as I look at this, one of the things that hit me, again, I think this totally reflects what the committee suggested we do. So, but a concern I had was the efficiency with which we can move forward once we say it's okay to go so. So for example, their next meeting is October 7th. We meet the Monday after that to approve if there's a suggestion to increase our face-to-face, that it's okay to move forward. We've got the positions in place to handle the tracing. Potentially, are we talking 2 weeks after that board meeting? And so given that would almost be a 5-week period, 3 weeks to study, then 2 weeks, and well, be 6 weeks, I guess. Wouldn't there be a way to streamline that by saying, okay, we're having a health meeting on October 7th. So for whatever target group we're looking at to consider expanding with, couldn't we use the time between now and that meeting to get the numbers of students whose families would commit to the face-to-face, so that by the time that meeting's taking place, that 2 weeks is really cut down, so it might be only a week after a board meeting?
Let me answer your question, and then let me toss something out to that. I just was very high-level draft working through, and I think it addresses a little bit of what you're getting to. But one of the pieces that why we built in the 2 weeks is, from our experience this past in August and in early September, is our experience has been until there's a decision as far as when something's going to happen. As far as you make a decision tonight or in October, that we haven't seen parents really put forth kind of what their intention is until that decision is finalized. So that's been a piece to try to project out. We can certainly do that. I just don't know how rock solid the numbers are for our planning purposes. Because what we've seen and what our trend has been is until that decision is absolutely finalized and that's what's happening, we haven't seen kind of an accurate description of what's actually the intents are. Could be wrong, but that's been our trend so far. But what I heard you also saying is you're kind of looking at the time frames between decision making and when you can kind of assess pieces. So what I've put in front of you, and I think Rebecca's just put it up here, and please just take this as a rough draft for what it's worth. And I've played around with numbers just based on where things occurred. And I took it up through 5 and 6, and I just made an assumption that data was looking good. So you kind of eliminate the constant of the data is looking positive. You kind of work through from medical advisory to a board meeting tonight where we're considering the reopening framework. I'm looking into the Plan A piece right here. That's October 7th. And that gives you then time from here to review data. You review it. If everything looks good, we approve it here on the 12th. That means 2 weeks after the 12th, your 3rd and 4th grade return on the 26th. Then if you took a period of time, and I think I just took a few weeks here to come back to medical advisory, so 3 weeks later, and then you start to look at kind of how that extrapolates down as far as when you can bring back other groups. And then you could continue to move that, and particularly if you broke out 7, 8, 9, 12, how it moves forward. One of the thoughts that we were talking about when we were looking at the data today was really how much time between a decision point do we want to have before we kind of review the next group coming in. I mean, so when you take a look at the medical advisory group, it ranged anywhere from dialogues of 2 weeks to 4 weeks. And one of the pieces I took a look at was if you moved, and we would have to have moved the committee, but if you were able to move this up a week, you, on the 29th, you hit your 14-day average. So you'd be able to take that chart that Kurt had, and you'd be able to fill in the 17-day average, the 14-day average. We would at least be able to then on the 30th present that data, which would be a 2-week snapshot of the data that we've been able to collect. It just moves your timelines up basically a week. So instead of looking at potential, you still need the 2 weeks to bring back 3rd and 4th grade, but instead of it coming, you'd have to create an additional board meeting on October 5th, and then you would look at a return date, potentially again, if all the data called for it, on the 19th. And there's different ways, but I think part of the pieces we have to look at is kind of how are we going to step into this given the data, given the data we have. From my perspective, we need to at least look at that 14-day track, because that's kind of what it's built off of, to get a sense of really how our data's trending. And I think part of what the medical advisory group was talking about was you're trying to differentiate Waunakee from downtown Madison. You're trying to say, yeah, there's high numbers Dane County-wise, but how is Waunakee trending? To get a good sense of that, that's where I just think that having at least that 7 and 14-day data dashboard is helpful. You would hit that in time if you moved medical advisory up. But that's the question I think that we need to try to talk about, was kind of what's then our gap between reevaluation after we make a decision. And this is kind of a stepping into this process, because we're already there with K2. It's really the decision for 3-4, and then starting to kind of pace it forward so that you have a staggered re-entry plan for any other grades. Thanks.
Your follow-up, go ahead.
Okay, so one of the things I think the public has to be aware of is that we can't promise a date. We can say we're hoping this is a date, and even with this projection, but if the data doesn't support it, then we may have to wait for the next review of data. So, but given all that, I'm not sure, and I guess I don't know how much work they put in on our elementary principals, or whichever principals would be involved in preparing for the next iteration. But if we were to contact our 3-4 parents this week and say, we're having this meeting on this date, if the number is good, we anticipate moving forward to opening up. We need you to commit now to sending your kids to, if you want them to come face to face. That would save us another week. And a week is a week, but we have a lot of people who want this to happen.
Right.
If it's not unduly burdening, I'm not sure why we couldn't ask, just, you need to know, this is our framework, we need this information if we want to move forward, as opposed to saying, okay, we need an initial 2 weeks after, whenever we have that board meeting. We can make it 1 week after that board meeting, and I think it would, again, make those who are looking for the face-to-face experience happier. If we're waiting a long time.
And I understand. I think the piece, and part of your answer is, I don't know, Mark. I'm going to be very honest, because part of it is how many kids are shifting, and then what does that do from not only a staffing level, which may require a shift. As you saw with bringing K2 in, we had to hire some staff. And we feel, elementary-wise, we have some abilities to do that better. So that, and then the other part, and that's a piece that I know Steve worked with Lamers very closely on, it requires us to then redo bus routes. So it's kind of once you have the data, then it's the staffing piece, then it's busing. The instructional part is not the heavy lift. I mean, that's an important part of our work, but we also are most astute at teaching face-to-face. It's the logistics of getting us properly staffed, get people arranged correctly, and then the busing that would have to go along with it. So even if I have those numbers ahead of time of a board meeting, does that mean that I can have a meeting on a Monday night and by the following Monday flip it? To me, that seems pretty tight. To be able to do it well without there being issues and being able to communicate out what we're doing.
Well, and that's an important thing. The operations piece is as important as the clinical.
And I know Brian and Steve and Amy work very closely with that, so they can certainly weigh in on that as well.
I think the other thing too, the reason that, we put that time frame between bringing the next cohort group in was just making sure that we had the processes and the staffing and so forth. To your point, do we need more contact tracers? And I think we may find that it goes pretty seamlessly, and we really don't. So I think this next group, the 3-4, is going to tell us a lot of information that will help us make decisions on when do we bring the next groups back.
Mark, you had a question?
Sure, but I have a lot, so. I guess I was a little surprised at the scope of what we're calling recommendations. I guess from the outset, Mark, I would disagree that I'm not entirely sure if this accurately depicts what was fully said in the meeting. I watched it twice, and I guess I was a little surprised in the way it was written up here, but we can get to that. Was there any discussion at the medical ad hoc committee level of the overall safety of operating the schools? Because it seems like we focused almost entirely on the metrics and the processes and the internal, how the sausage is made, rather than, is it safe for our students and staff to be in the buildings?
I would say that I would answer that similarly to how Mark kind of reflected the piece with that they felt like what we've done with K2 and with some of the processes we've put in place, that they felt that generally that we've addressed many of the concerns from that perspective.
Okay, so that was what I expected you to say.
So from a PPE standpoint, from like a health check standpoint, as far as what we've initially done with the contact tracing for K2, I think as they reviewed that piece, it was generally a piece of saying that has gone relatively well.
Right, like cohorting students so they're not mixing and all that.
That was positively received by the committee, and I think that's what, Mark, you were referring to.
So that all being said, what's the difference between K through 2 and 3 through 4 right now?
Right. I think the piece that, and I'm going to go off of what I heard at the committee and what I was taking away, Mike. So I mean, Brian and Jack can weigh in as well, and others who've watched it or who were at part of the meeting, is that there wasn't necessarily a high-level concern to bring them back. There was a concern to figure out, before we do that, we should have an indication of how are the data numbers within the county reflecting the pieces that would be happening locally. And and the examples we talked about were there's not a consensus of that everything's going to stay within the isthmus or within the UW. And saying from a cautionary standpoint, we should be looking at our data to see, is it going to now spread to other parts of our communities? And before we bring back more students, we should at least have a picture of that. That's what I generally heard, and what I think was their reason for saying, instead of coming to this meeting tonight and saying, let's have a motion to bring back 3-4, their piece was, my words, you take a pause for a few weeks to collect some data to see how are things trending locally. That was kind of my...
Sure, and I mean, I don't mean to cast aspersions on how you wrote this up. It was just getting to that point where it said 3 to 4 weeks. Well,
Okay.
Bill Random was sitting there and said 3 to 4. Dr. Anderson was sitting next to him and said 1.
Yep.
And the middle school nurse sitting over here said, do not open new buildings at all.
Right.
So it struck me as all over the place.
It was.
So I think, you know, what I heard is that, one, we want to have our contact tracing in place.
Right.
Okay? So, you know, if we open school tomorrow, we don't have that in place. So I think where the 2 to 3 weeks comes from is get that contact tracing in place. We may not have the nurse, but we should be able to bring on the contact tracers so that we can really start understanding what's going on. And then, you know, once you get that process under control, then you bring 3, 4 back, and like I say, you may be able to get to a point where you feel really comfortable and start bringing these things back quicker.
I would say, Mike, I don't think there was ever a point of saying we shouldn't consider 3, 4. It was a point of saying we should try to get a better sense of where's our data at and make sure that we can handle it internally. And I think just in the last number of days, as we've started to look at data, we're getting a better sense of what our process is and how to kind of start tracking. We're learning and doing better every day with it. I think that's a very accurate piece of it. But I think that's what the committee was trying to caution us of not moving too fast so the system gets overwhelmed and then things get through the cracks, which could have negative effects. That's my take and my words. Thank you.
Brian?
So I know that Dr. Anna and Dr. Anderson, there was a time where they said, would you be in favor of bringing back 3, 4? They said, not at this time, bluntly. I mean, it went by quick, and some of it had to do with you're not ready because we don't have the processes that Jack was talking about in place to be able to handle it if we had a big outbreak 1 week or something like that, to be able to handle it. You know, I mean, this whole discussion is there's a lot of built-in bias, and we have to look at our data that we're going to collect to be able to make our decisions. I mean, we all have a stake in this, in the game, in this community. We have got this far, and I think we have got to the point where now we can start collecting some local data, and then we're in school, and we can compare it to that. Their worry was, if we look at our school data and we look at our community data, and we see a rise in the community, and we see a rise in our schools, we might be a contributor to that rise. And so that's what we need to think about pulling back. So that 3 to 4 weeks is for us to gather what we need to make a decision. It may be, that's our plan, but it may be, nope, numbers haven't improved, they've gone up. We just push 3, 4 back to another 3 weeks. And you know, that's what we're gonna have to deal with. But I think this metric at least gets us narrowed down to our community. But yeah, I agree. I mean, if we don't have the processes in places, and this is learning, we're 2 weeks in. You know, we're still learning on every day it's going on, and we're finding out that we need this and we need that to be able to make this work. Last meeting we talked about there's 28 positions that we don't have to. So we need positions to be able to open up the school as well. So there's a lot of, it's just not opening and we're hoping things go well. We have to make sure that it's going to go smoothly, as smooth as it can in this situation. So I thought the doctors were pretty blunt when they said, I wouldn't bring them back yet. We need more information.
So did they say we should shut down K-2?
No, they said they wouldn't. That's not what I
So-
heard.
so I-
No, we keep it here, but I don't think we should bring more in.
I think what I heard was get the processes under control so you don't overload the system. And that makes sense, you know, from a 2 to 3 week period so that we can get the appropriate resources in place and we track this stuff. And then, you know, I think, you know, once we get that going, we're getting more efficient at what we're doing and how we're doing the work, to Randy's point, to Kurt's point. And with the appropriate focus on, you know, the COVID command center, I think, you know, we'll be able to move forward, make some solid decisions.
The thing was, I was extremely pleased to hear the committee not suggesting we should shut down K2. I mean, we have to remember, when we went to K2, the county daily average was 52. When we met the next time, it was like 92, and but they had not themselves come out and said, we want to shut down K2, even though the numbers had almost doubled. Today, there are 170 cases per day. So despite this upward climb, our local people say, given what we know right now, they support what we're doing, but now we need to get the data to continue moving forward. Now, the Dane County numbers might continue to grow, but if ours stay stable, then that gives us a sign of what we can do. But to Brian's point, yeah, we need the time to do that. And so it's nice to set a benchmark, but you can't draw a line in the sand and say, this is when it's going to be.
Public Health Medicine, Dane County, we had a meeting with them on Friday, and the question that came up in our group was, are they planning to shut down K2? As far as a recommendation, they can't do it by order. Their comment was at this point, no, because what they're tracking is trying to see where are the high numbers at and how are those impacting places that are making decisions. So there's actually a couple districts that are starting to move forward with plans in early October to bring back some of their K2. I think McFarland brought some back last week. And that was under those, but it plays to the point that I think Dr. Anderson said, was trying to have a metric that's just green, yellow, red is just too hard. There's a narrative, there's another part to this, there's a process piece. And that's what I think that you're finding with some of the public health pieces, is that there's other aspects that have to be looked at. And I think that's where we're at as well.
Other questions and comments yet? So basically what we're looking for is a motion to create basically this page. Correct?
Right. I think what we're looking at is, I think there's a couple of things we're looking at here tonight. If you look at our agenda, there's 3 different pieces on there. One is the report from the ad hoc committee. Second is the contact tracing process, and the third is the positions.
So you have, but for the board,
Right.
we have to do a motion on basically creating the decision-making approach. I would think 2 is the plan A or B timeline, or some version someone else would want to make a motion on. And the third part is about approving the positions.
That's correct. I would agree with that.
So obviously you can take what was written and turn it into a motion. You could suggest something else or modification. But I think probably the first one that we should do is the decision-making approach. So what they've laid out is the concept that basically the district, community, and data will be assessed monthly by the medical ad hoc committee and the admin team. And then there would probably be some form of recommendation of any necessary changes or modifications made to the board. And then the board will, of course, vote on that. And where practical, the district will be projecting changes 2 weeks in advance. Now, I think that's also going to require the board to understand we're going to be meeting right after the ad hoc committee every single time. And whether that's on a monthly or 2-week basis, it's probably going to be, for us, it's going to have to be a 2-week basis, because we'll have our regular board meeting, and then we'll have the one right after the ad hoc committee. The ad hoc committee looks like it's going to be somewhere in the middle of the month every time. So that would kind of be the cycle. Now, of course, that's all going to modify based on if the data pushes us one way or the other quickly.
But if the ad hoc committee meets on a monthly basis, then you could have the ad hoc committee the week before the board meeting. So you wouldn't have to have a special meeting.
You could do that.
It becomes an agenda item.
You could do it that way, Or you could take the Plan B approach, if someone wanted to do that. The one bad thing about doing it is the regular board meeting, in my mind, this is a huge issue every single time. If you have part of your regular board meeting, you're looking at midnight meetings again. Because probably by the time you get through deciding, opening up whole buildings and making staff changes and everything, that's going to be not a short discussion. That would be the one negative I think about. That right now, we could almost get to a cycle where you'd be every 2 weeks. I think if we take the Plan B and set it up that way, and you start looking forward, it's either going to be the week before the board meeting or 2 weeks before the board meeting, depending on how many weeks you have in a month. I gotta admit, my personal approach would be keep it off the board meeting because it's too big, especially if something really major is going to be done. It'd be very hard to have that in a regular board meeting.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, is this a big enough issue that we need to meet every 2 weeks?
Yep.
We've already spent an hour and a half and don't have a single motion yet.
You know,
For
the
sure, for
community,
three,
the staff,
four.
everybody's carrying something here. We have to too.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
I threw out the Plan B as an alternative to try to respect the process of the data piece, but also respect kind of some feedback as far as is there a way to move it a little bit sooner. That was kind of where that Plan B was originally.
I make the motion for Plan B.
I'll second that.
so there's,
Motion for Plan B.
setting the first time frame.
Did you say
B.
B. I have a question.
I
What,
would take that motion to also mean that those board meetings would be created.
It would mean that, and I would have, yes, the board meeting would have to be created. We create an additional board meeting on the 5th, and then we would confirm that we are able to get our medical advisory committee. And I would say medical advisory could probably, we'd throw out probably 2 dates, either like the Wednesday or the Thursday. Because that way we would, of that week, to see if we could meet during that.
And we have a second on that. So now discussion on creating the timeline for Plan B.
I have a question on that.
Yeah.
I guess I want to know from administration, is there preferred timeline for you, A or B? Do you feel pressure to do B?
I think the timeline we have is making sure we have the 2 weeks to be able to do the implementation. And I think from a respect of having the data, we'll have the 14 days data on the 29th of September. So as long as the ad hoc committee could come together that week, that doesn't give me concern. I'm looking at Kurt and others. It's probably a little, we'll have to get moving with some of the pieces with hiring the contact tracer and some of those pieces, but you're still looking at then a return somewhere around the 19th, which gives us some time to really navigate that whole process.
And that motion would also fall within the decision-making approach that was laid out. It basically creates that process at the same time.
So it's just the timeline plus it's what we're saying.
Dave, I'd
Yes.
like to make an amendment to Jack's motion.
Okay.
And I already talked to you about this in general, but it's not lost on me that a lot of comments we get are about people beyond these grades. I don't want anyone to think my personal biases are dictating what I'm doing. So I want to amend the motion to direct administration to identify classes in middle school and high school that can't meaningfully function in a virtual fashion. That's giving you the discretion to figure out what those are. And it would be talking to those grades saying that there are things that we know are not working because there are classes that just don't work in this fashion. And at least identify ways that we could bring some students in ahead of time if administration in individual buildings see that it can happen. Maybe that's not, I don't know. I'm not.
That's actually, that process is just beginning.
Okay.
So what you're talking about is a process I know that Tim Shell shared with me today about reaching out to staff, actually having them put forth like I'm going to use the term application, but
Sure.
basically some sort of a form that they fill out about what some of their needs were and how they would do this. Our only piece is we want to do it in a measured way too, so we don't overload the system. But that's the conversation we're starting.
Okay.
So that's your motion. I just want to clarify because somebody's going to have to second it. the concept, and I'm not sure on the legality of this, is if we open up classes, and I think this is different than enhanced virtual. Enhanced virtual is almost more individuals. But is a class such as welding or woods or a lab such that you're opening a new building to a full classroom, is that something the board needs to approve, or is that something the district can just do? Although that could get quite a large number of people.
And I think that's where I think where Mike is leaving, at least the way I'm interpreting it, Mike, is you're leaving that up to administration to be able to manage.
Yes.
The piece that you're gonna have, that we've talked about, is let's just pick a class, a welding class, for example. You're gonna have some of those kids, potentially, who aren't gonna wanna come in, because they wanna stay virtually. So we have to also make sure that the activities that we're doing, that there is an option for us to be able to address those kids' needs as well, and help, and it's an enhanced piece then for those kids that are coming in. But I think that's that, and then also looking at the transportation aspect, because we don't want that to be a barrier, but we also don't want it to be an equity issue where certain kids can come in and other kids don't. So that's the logistical piece we're navigating, is how do we try to marry those pieces together. So I see Tim is walking down the hall, so we're talking about 712. I'm sure he can add a little. Tim, can I just ask you to talk a little bit about your process that you're just initiating with 712 with regards to some of the enhanced remote, just so that the board understands kind of what that's starting to frame up to look like? Because I think it's very closely aligned with what Mike is proposing.
Yeah, I can speak to that briefly, Randy, and then if there's some questions. I mean, the last time we were together, we covered some of this ground. We had always envisioned, if we were able to, under county regulations, to implement that enhanced aspect that would start with students with disabilities coming in, which we started 2 weeks ago, going on to other special pops, and then moving on to general education students that either due to engagement reasons or curricular reasons, we felt there would be a benefit from having them come on site. And you know, even back in the summer when we were talking about this, we were talking about welding or auto tech, you know, art, science labs. And so where we're at in the process is at our last 712 principals meeting last week, we began the process of drafting a template, and Randy, that's what I showed you earlier today, for teachers who had an interest. And so, was it last week or the week before that we had the email from our current tech ed teachers talking about their interest in doing this? You know, where they would submit, we need to understand how many students, how large the groups, was there a transportation need? Many of our students can transport themselves, not everybody can. We need to make sure there's equity of access. What would the needs be for special cleaning? You know, if there's shared equipment, do we have time? What's our pacing to kind of clean it in between? And once we get that template finalized, our vision is we begin to invite staff to submit applications. We would probably start small, just because we want to make sure our procedures for bringing additional students in the building were working well, and then we would move it up over time. So that's kind of where we are at. You know, I would be happy, you know, the next time you meet to kind of, you know, maybe with a high school team and maybe some other principals give you a little more in-depth look at what our process would be like. But that really is what we're building towards.
If I can just add another piece, one of the things, and it relates to 712, it relates to kind of the co-curricular side of that. That's probably where I've gotten an additional communications from parents of wanting us to continue to do more options there, particularly as we start to bridge between fall and winter sports, open gyms, etc. I've kind of paused on that piece and shared just as that I'd bring that back in October, and that's the part of a review process as well, to make sure we can can do them well and also handle the numbers that we're talking about. But I also believe we have to put an effort not only to those co-curricular type things, which are of importance to families, but also the academic pieces to see how we can help support some of those programs that have those hands-on needs, as Mike and Tim articulated.
So we have an amendment
Second.
and a second. So we are now just discussing the amendment part to add into it. I think this is important. It seems so far off for the possibility of high school to get back in person. And as we've heard from one parent tonight, and I know many of you have received many emails about the feeling that the high school is really being left behind in this process. I think this is something the board needs to constantly look at and pay attention to. And this is probably the strongest thing we can do the fastest. So I'm going to support the amendment. And that way, at least we'll know, the public will know that we are putting the resources and the effort to get those classes going. And they'll know as they'll see the classes also coming up along with the rest of it.
I just asked Mike make sure I understand exactly what your amendment is. It's very much in line with what Tim is talking about with trying to look at those different programs from an
It's similar, and I even wrote it down.
We have the exact wording in writing here, and I suggest, because this is getting tough. Direct administration to immediately identify all classes that cannot meaningfully function in a virtual fashion, and direct staff of such classes to prepare for students if class can be conducted in a safe, socially distanced manner, and this applies to the middle school and high school.
So
I'll give you the wording.
I guess it's very close to what Tim described, but I would say it's more of a top-down approach rather than a bottom-up approach, where I think you're talking about staff saying if they have an interest in doing it. I guess I would be more interested in what does administration determine is something that can't meaningfully work, and then go down to staff and say, are you available to do this, rather than asking them to then take the lead and say, I want to come back. So it's just the same thing done in a slightly different way.
But is it the same thing? I mean, you're still holding a group of kids who may not want to come back, and are you saying that that class can't be taught virtually?
No, the virtual option would, we have stated already, all students are offered virtual.
But
They would
I
still get
thought
the
within
virtu-
his idea was that this couldn't, we have to have it because it can't be done virtually.
Well, you can't weld unless you have a welder in your garage. So I think
However,
that's
I think we already agreed that if a student didn't want to come face to face, they had the virtual option. That's part of our basic premise. So if we are moving XYZ classes to an opportunity to come place, that doesn't disregard the option to be virtual.
That wasn't the intent, so thank you for clarifying.
And I think the one piece that we just want to make sure is that we don't disadvantage some students over others and trying to work through some of those pieces. That's a piece that we want to make sure we don't lose.
I mean, to be clear, I mean, in some respects, this is a very simple concept, but in some respects, not so simple. So the simple thing is we want to provide, where we can safely manage it, students with access to hands-on opportunities that are not easily provided virtually. To be said, very simple concept, and certainly we can apply our administrative judgment. I tend to feel it's the instructor who's going to have the best sense of where things simply need to happen in the schools. And I think if we look at the communication we've had from some of our instructors, we can see their minds are turning this way. Where it becomes less simple is to the point that Mark brings up. We may have students who may choose not to come onto campus even though we provide the opportunity. And so to the extent we would say we'd bring an entire class in, we can't do that for all the kids in the class. And I think it's a lot easier to bring in students in a class for select hands-on activities. And for example, instead of having the entire welding class come on site, have key activities that can't be replicated off-site for welding come on site. The other thing we will have to figure out, and sitting here today, I can't tell you exactly what it would look like, except I know what we can't do, is we have to be very cautious about how we grade these kinds of activities. So we can provide the learning experience for a student, but anything that would count for a grade that would be an on-site activity, we would have to provide some kind of equivalent or substitute activity off-site for the student who chose, their family chose to keep them virtual. So, I think the concept's really simple, but there are some implementation aspects, especially if this scales up, we're going to have to do some thinking about yet.
I guess that's why I like the less directive approach from the board, making it, or the administration, making it more from the, what does a teacher have within their curriculum, or how are they going to present it? So I guess I'm worried about pressure from us, or the administration. I want it to come from the teachers.
Well, I certainly get the accountability piece. I mean, there are a lot of expectations out there. Certainly, we hear the same comments you're hearing. If it's a matter of coming back, every meeting or two and making sure we give you a good update on how this piece is moving along, I think, obviously, that's a very reasonable thing. It is a little different. There are some other districts in the county that are looking at doing this. But again, this is one of those areas where we're doing a little earlier, at least we hope, than some of the other districts in the county.
I
So-
think Mike's motion actually gives that discretion to the administration on how to work best with the staff to get where we want to get. I think the flexibility is there. And I trust the way you guys have worked with our staff in the past. It's a collaborative approach, so I'm not sure I'm worried about that approach. I think it's a legitimate concern, but given the culture that we have here, I don't think it's one that needs to weigh heavily on us.
Whole question.
There's a motion to call the question.
Sorry.
There's a second. It's non-debatable. All those in favor of ending debate on the amendment, please say yes.
Yes.
All those opposed say no. So we are now just voting to include the amendment into the original motion. All those in favor of including the amendment, say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. And that passed unanimously. So now we're back to the original motion, which was to use the time frame of Plan B with the decision, basically implementing the decision-making approach under the Plan B time frame. Is there any further discussion?
Plan B because it moves faster? Is that
It's a week faster. It still meets the timeline the ad hoc committee suggested and still gives us the review. That's my view. Any further discussion?
If the data's there, we'll move. If it doesn't, we won't.
All, well, that's going to happen. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. And the motion passes. So please realize that just added two new, well, actually only one. The 9th is a regular board meeting, isn't it?
We normally we're going to meet on the 28th, so we won't meet next Monday then. We would then meet on the 5th. So when we
First Monday.
setting meetings, we'll have to approve that. The other item then tonight would be the additional.
And we now have to do the addition of the school nurse and the tracing.
So we'll accept the proposal for
A motion
Second.
to suggest the motion.
Second.
There's a second by Mike. Any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no.
So before we close, can I raise a point of order? I just want to clarify, because what we did with this motion, I think effectively supersedes the previous motion we had back at the start of August for 5 through 12.
Yes.
So do we need any type of motion to clarify that we're vacating that motion, or have we done that by second motion?
Which is, remember in our original motion opening school, we said
Quarter 2.
nothing else was going to, we were going to look at Q2 as the date for opening anything else. We have basically implemented a different time frame. That is true.
So is that clear enough, or do we need to vacate that?
So I
I see
make a
it.
motion to vacate previous motion.
And there we,
Seconded.
and there's a second. So this is to vacate the decision of opening other classes on the second quarter using this new process. Instead, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Oh, unless there was discussion, I apologize. No discussion, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. Thank you.
We did the nurse.
Yes,
Yeah.
you did that right.
Dave,
The nurse was,
All right, just
10
Like-
seconds, Dave.
All right.
I got one.
Agendas and meetings,
Oh.
so.
Just one point.
yes,
For those of you who I offended by using the word bias, I was relating it to research, formal research, where it's built-in bias. And right at this point, we have to look at the data. It wasn't to pinpoint that somebody's being biased in here. It's just, who's my connection with research? So,
and just so I don't forget at our next meeting, I'd like to say thank Northbridge Church, which provided these masks to the entire staff of the community school district. And anything else, then I would take a motion to adjourn.
I have a question.
Oh, we have to, future meeting.
I'd like to know what our meeting dates are in October, now that we've changed it
Well,
around.
you are.
And are we doing it on the 28th?
Let's go through. So what we have scheduled right now is a meeting on the 28th.
So
What I would
cancel?
say, here's what I'm gonna say.
September
Let's just
28th.
plan that we're not gonna have it, but let's not remove that meeting yet, because you never know what happens between now and Monday. If I don't feel we need it, I'll just cancel it on Thursday or Friday.
And that's for
just
6 p.m.
cautionary, just to bring a special meeting together is a lot of process. So then I would say we need to add a special meeting, or an additional meeting, I'm sorry, for October 5th. And I would say if we did that at 6 o'clock, does that work? So we would need a motion on that one.
Motion.
Is it, we're saying motion one, right?
What?
We're saying for the one meeting.
Yeah, this is gonna be a second.
Just do one.
Want to do them all together? All right, so the 5th is where we would meet, where we would come back to address the reopening pieces for 3rd and 4th grade. The 12th, we already have our regular meeting. The 19th is our annual meeting, which we've already approved. And then what we're suggesting is the 26th, because that's where we would set the levy. So it's every Monday for the next month. Okay, and that's, unfortunately, that's normally what October looks like,
It does.
because we have the 26th is where we have to then set the final levy in preparation of certifying that as we move forward.
That'll be a quick one, usually.
So the 5th and the 26th, and you can, if you want to do 6 o'clock for both, those are the two that we would need a motion on, because I believe we've already approved the annual.
We already did.
So moved for 6 PM on the 5th and 6 PM on the 26th.
Second by Jack. Any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no.
And did we set it for 6 o'clock on the 28th, if we have it?
6
Yes.
yes.
And I will let you know by the end of the week, and hopefully we can not have that one.
Is there a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn.
Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Thank you very much.